Like many people, I spent the majority of last year absolutely obsessed with the Great Ace Attorney series of games. It sure did take a while for them to come out of Japan, 6 years to be precise, but when they did, it was more than worth the wait. Not only did they update the gameplay of the now 20-year-old Ace Attorney series, they also injected it with the allure of the classic Sherlock Holmes stories and moved proceedings to foggy old London town. Many have called them the best games in the series, and I definitely would agree. In fact, both games were so good that the question on everyone's lips now is, will there be a sequel? Capcom hasn't exactly denied the possibility, instead asking players in a mammoth survey from last year whether they would like to see another entry in the series. It's a little worrying that series creator Shu Takumi hasn't actually been credited on anything since Monster Hunter Riders in 2020, but here's hoping an estimated 300,000 units sold with the English collection can get the ball rolling on something at the very least. The lack of official information means that it now falls on both fans and legal enthusiasts alike to imagine what a follow-up to 2017's Resolve might look like. I happen to be one of those people. Someone who has spent way too much time thinking about underdeveloped characters and potential plot lines that I just had to get my ideas out there in some form or another. And while I am aware that some of this or none of this might come true, here's what I reckon a Great Ace Attorney sequel might look like. Obviously there will be spoilers, so if you haven't played both Adventure and Resolve yet, then I would suggest clicking off this video now. First of all, what marked the Great Ace Attorney apart from all of the other Ace Attorney games was that it took place in a clearly defined setting. Sure, Phoenix Wright's adventures technically all took place in Los Angeles, but the difference between the game's original setting and the localization often led to some hilarious contradictions. None of these problems exist in either Adventure or Resolve. The series' Japanese roots are firmly acknowledged, and every step is taken to ensure that locales are both coherently and correctly represented in the translation. Kim Morrissey of Anime News Network did an excellent article detailing how much work the team put into making the localization as good as possible, including references from both real-life Victorian Britain as well as the wider Sherlock Holmes mythos. As a result, the Great Ace Attorney feels like much more of a period piece than any other game in the series thus far. It'd be a shame to lose this in any subsequent follow-ups, so my idea is to set the sequel in Meiji-era Japan. Why? Because although the first two games are essentially about Anglo-Japanese relations, we barely got to see anything of what life was like in Japan at the time. I can promise you that Japan was just as dynamic and exciting at the turn of the 19th century as Victorian Britain was in the first two games. It's in this era that heavy industry begins to assert itself, and the population is drawn in from the countryside, leading to the growth of modern day metropolises such as Tokyo and Osaka. You also have the emergence of contemporary Japanese culture through such figures as Natsume Soseki, who obviously already appeared in the first two games, but there's also Moriogai. There's also the First Sino-Japanese War, but I think that might be a bit of a controversial subject to tackle in a silly lawyer game. All of these subjects and more can be addressed and incorporated into the story of the follow-up, depending on which year the sequel takes place in. I'll talk about this later on, but I'm pretty much fine with anything as long as it's actually set in the Meiji era of Japan, so that's anywhere up until 1912. It might be nice to skip forward a couple of years to mirror the time skip that happened between Trials and Tribulations and Apollo Justice, but I'd ultimately leave it up to the development team to decide. Aside from the story potential, one other reason why it would make sense to return to Japan is that Ryunosuke and Susato do so at the end of Resolve. They seem pretty set on using what they learned in London to help improve the Japanese justice system, so it would take away from their personal journey somewhat if we were to force a return to the first two game setting. I'm also sure that the team can craft some great comedy moments around Iris and Sherlock's reactions to various aspects of Japanese culture. That's right, I want pretty much all of the major characters from the first two games to return for the sequel, with the obvious exceptions of course of Strongheart and Gregson. Ryunosuke, Susato, Kazuma, Van Zieks, Sherlock, Iris, Gina, Rei, Hosonaga, Soseki. It'd be rude not to include them all. And if you're wondering what the logistics of importing several denizens of London town to Japan would be, then don't worry, because I'm going to address this in the story section later on. Arguably even more important than the question of who will be returning for the sequel is the question of who will be the protagonist. Now you might just assume that it would be Ryunosuke, but there is actually a precedent for changing things up when we look at the release of Apollo Justice. I'm also not sure if there's much more to Ryunosuke's journey beyond more victories and more steps on the path towards becoming the titular Great Ace Attorney, so I'd like to propose that Susato be made the protagonist for the sequel instead. The reasons? Well, there's two reasons really. First of all, I think she's already proved her mettle as both an attorney and as a protagonist in the first case of the second game. I have to admit that the adventure of the Great Blossoming Attorney is probably one of my favourite cases in the entire series due to Susato's hot-headedness, and her dynamic with Ray in disguise is pretty hilarious. She could definitely carry a game on her own. Secondly, I feel like the first two games actually did Susato a bit of a disservice when it comes to examining the fallout surrounding Kazuma's return at the end of Twisted Karma and his last bow. It's worth noting that Susato literally studied her entire life to become his assistant, so to be cast away when he became a prosecutor surely caused some emotional damage. I think that the sequel has the potential to explore this further if Susato is positioned as the protagonist, although detailing anything more would stray into the realm of story and plot. Now that we have the status of the established characters confirmed, let's talk about what kind of new additions we're going to be making for the sequel. I'm not going to go into exhaustive detail here because the Ace Attorney series always features a whole litany of different criminals, victims and witnesses, but there will be some major additions. In particular, I want the sequel to draw more inspiration from the Sherlock Holmes mythos. This is because although there are many references to and characters from the original Sherlock Holmes stories in the first two games, there are some glaring omissions. First of all, how come the Baker Street Irregulars failed to feature in a single case? I mean, Sherlock calls on this ragtag group of street urchins all the time in the books to help solve cases because they can hear things that adults cannot. Their absence always felt a little strange to me, so let's right that wrong in the sequel. Secondly, and arguably more importantly, how is it that Sherlock Holmes' nemesis, Professor James Moriarty, was not mentioned in any of the cases, not even once? It's definitely true that he doesn't feature in the original books nearly as much as subsequent adaptations, but he's still regarded as one of Sherlock's most formidable and capable adversaries that even led to his shocking, albeit temporary, death. Beyond simply correcting this glaring omission, I believe that his inclusion in the cast would be what makes a Great Ace Attorney sequel truly something special. Having laid the groundwork for our imaginary Great Ace Attorney sequel by considering the setting and characters, let's finally dive into the actual plot. Without further ado, here's my first concrete story beat. Have Moriarty kill Sherlock, or at least for a little bit. Not only would this be a nice way to incorporate the final problem into the series, it would also fit in quite naturally, I think, with the theme suggested by the characters and the setting. It just so happens that the Great Ace Attorney takes place around exactly the same time that Britain's imperial century is coming to an end, after which Britain's standing on the world stage would decline in comparison to newer powers such as Germany, the United States and Japan. Sherlock Holmes also spent the majority of the first two games teaching two foreigners the art of deduction by making up silly situations, so it's possible that he was looking for a successor. The ideas of legacy and the new generation are already up in the air, I think, and this will form the groundwork for my imaginary plotline. The basic outline of the plot is as follows. Several years after returning from London, Ryunosuke and Susato are running a successful legal consultancy in the rapidly expanding Tokyo metropolis, when the Forensic Science Symposium chooses the capital city to reconvene now that the smoke from the Strongheart scandal is cleared. The best and brightest minds in Europe gather under one roof. Yet, nefarious forces are moving in the background, and it will fall upon our protagonist to solve the mystery by picking up the pieces left behind by the great Sherlock Holmes, who has suddenly disappeared without a trace. Depending on how many games this sequel is allowed to take up, it could be another duology, it could not. You can either play Sherlock's death at the beginning of the story, or partway through for maximum dramatic effects. Moreover, I want Susato and Ryunosuke to solve the mystery by leaning on the Japanese section of the Baker Street Irregulars, because of course they're international, as well as old friends that have come from London to Tokyo for the symposium. This solves the problem of how so many characters from London have made their way to Japan quite nicely, with the exception of perhaps Moriarty. Now don't worry, because I have something special planned for the Sinister Professor. Remember how Strongheart was at the top of a secret organisation with influence powerful enough that it extended across international borders? Yeah. I don't think that something like that would go away overnight simply because one man disappeared from the top. Naturally, Moriarty is the one who takes his place in the sequel, either through pre-existing influence in the organisation or via a concerted takeover from the outside. I think both make sense for his character really. So over the course of the game, Ryunosuke and Susato put together the pieces of Moriarty's takeover as well as the Reaper organisation's plans for the Forensic Science Symposium. Even though I want Susato to be the main focus of the sequel, I think it's fine if the game alternates between her and Ryunosuke in the courtroom, just like other entries in the series. Of course, all of this plot heavy stuff can then be interspersed with more coincidental cases that showcase everyday life in Meiji Japan, and here is where I think the setting has another distinct draw. The clash between old and new was present everywhere and affecting all layers of society at the time. This is something that Natsume Soseki talked a lot about in his works, so it's good that he's already a character in the series, but I think that introducing Morioka as a character might help to potentially explore this fascinating contradiction even further. Moreover, I want the sequel to address two things that were present in the first two games but not given nearly enough gravitas. I've already talked about the apparent ease with which Susato accepted Kazuma's resurrection, so I believe that Sherlock's disappearance will offer her a great opportunity to re-examine what she wants to do with her life. Perhaps she's dissatisfied with her work as Ryunosuke's assistant, perhaps she's not, but I can't think of a better person to tackle the question of Sherlock's successor than one of his biggest fans. It'd also be nice to see a female protagonist alongside a male one in this spin-off series, especially when women's rights was such a big issue at the time. Finally, what's really interesting about Sherlock Holmes in The Great Ace Attorney is that he exists as both a fictional character and a real person, which is something I've never seen in any other adaptation before. This is something that no one really comments on in the original games, which is pretty weird when you consider that his description in the books is quite different from how he appears in the games. One interesting, if a little bit tragic idea that I have is that when Sherlock Holmes comes back from dying, just like he does after the final problem, it could be an interesting twist if he starts to have problems with his memory and struggles to differentiate between the fictional and real life versions of himself. That might be a little heavy for a series that's usually quite light-hearted, so I guess it's just a crazy idea that I'm throwing out there. As I said at the beginning, I don't know if any of this will actually resemble a Great Ace Attorney sequel if and when it actually gets made. I'd like to think that I based enough of my imagining off of precedents set by previous games, as well as the first two games themselves, but that's not really for me to decide, is it? The beautiful thing about the internet is that we can communicate instantaneously on just about any subject under the sun. So if my vision for a Great Ace Attorney sequel set in Meiji-era Japan, featuring characters both old and new, and focus mainly on the ideas of legacy and the new generation sounds great, then let me know. Equally, if you disagree and have your own idea of what a Great Ace Attorney sequel might look like, then let me know. Treat the comments like a forum thread and go wild with your theories. My only real wish is that the real Great Ace Attorney sequel doesn't get ruined by all of the speculation. I've seen plenty of films, games and manga that ultimately don't live up to the expectations set by fans before release, as they begin to blur the line between wishful thinking and logical deduction. But perhaps that's the fun of it, seeing where that line is, and seeing just how far the finished product strays from it. In any case, The Great Ace Attorney? Pretty good. I'd also like to see a sequel to it, and I believe that there's enough material from the first two games to warrant it. If you want to hire me as a writer, Capcom, then my DMs are open. But in the meantime, I suppose I'll see you all on the next one. Bye!